Yes.
Okay, that was a technical glitch. So my name is Sable Boroff, and I'm giving my history talk on the history of forensic science, also known as CSI to us crime scene drama fanatics like I am. It means crime scene investigation. The word forensics comes from the ancient Roman word from meaning giving evidence before the forum. So that's where the word forensic comes from. And it's actually it's been a sort of a new idea to apply the idea of science to criminal investigation. For many years, many countries didn't do that. Although I'm going to give some early history of it. I'm dedicating this to Keith, who isn't here today because he's on the AIDS ride.
You're having so much fun.
Being dedicated, riding all the way, so he will see this later, but it's for him. So I'm starting with the ancient history of it. One of the earliest things I was able to find is 44 BC. Julius Caesar was assassinated, and the doctor of the time examined his corpse and found 23 stab wounds. You know, because as you know, the story is they all stabbed him because they didn't all want to go to jail, and they figured if they all stabbed Caesar, then none of them would go to jail. And that's why the whole Senate stabbed him. But the doctor examined his corpse, and he found 23 stab wounds, but only one was fatal. But I don't know what happened exactly, and I didn't finish the research on that as to whether one guy went to jail or not. But it was a coup, and it was very, very big deal. And then in 400 AD, German Slavic government said with the law that only medical expert could determine the cause of death in crimes, and that was 400 AD. In 700 AD, in China, they used fingerprints to make seals on documents for the court. They didn't use it for criminal, but they did have the idea of fingerprints to determine identity of the owner of a document. And in 1248 in China, like a lot of things, China was way ahead of the Western world. I mean, West didn't come up with this fingerprints until the late 1800s. And this was in 700 AD. In 1248, there was a procedures for determining a suspicious death was written by a Chinese doctor to distinguish drowning from strangulation, and it was the first recorded incidence of a medical doctor to solve a crime. And then in 1600, I don't know where, the first pathology reports were created. In 1784, they matched physical evidence leading to a murder conviction in England. There was a victim had the torn edge of a newspaper. He was shot. And then they found the perpetrator with the pistol with the other part of the newspaper was in his pocket. So they saw that's how they convicted that guy in 1784. And I have more stuff like that. So in 1854, San Francisco uses photographs for criminal ID, which is the first U.S. city to do it. And in the late 1800s, things really took off. That was the late 1800s. In 1902, in Switzerland, they had the first formal school of forensic science. It was the first one ever. And then in the 1930s, there were schools around the world. And in 1950, the American Academy of Forensic Science was created in America, in Chicago. In 1888, forensic doctors started to try to examine Jack the Ripper, which I will talk about more at another time. But they wanted to examine the wound pattern to try to determine what kind of weapon was used and who might have done it. And that was a big moment for forensic science. In the 1800s, they studied decomposition of bodies to see how long they'd been laying there. And also, they had a test for the presence of blood. They also developed a test in the 1800s to determine if blood was animal or human. They didn't know, prior to that, because it looks the same. They started bullet comparisons, toxology. In 1836, they developed a test for arsenic, which was used for poisoning. And they started in the 1800s to document evidence at crime scenes. First recorded use of fingerprints to solve crimes was in the late 1800s. The early people that did forensic science were self-taught. There were no schools. They were brilliant people, and women too. But later on they had the schools. They did bullet comparisons, blood type techniques. The test for luminol to determine if someone had tried to clean up human blood, which they still use on TV today, was coming around early 1900s. And in the 1980s, of course, we get DNA, which we all know about today, very popular. In 86, they had profiling of DNA, and in 1994, they developed the first DNA database, which they're still using that today. But actually, even fingerprints aren't foolproof. Bullet ballistics aren't foolproof, because when a bullet is shot, when it hits something, it can be damaged, it can have other marks on it. So none of this is as foolproof as we actually think it is. They also, DNA evidence can be wrong. Insects are a reliable indicator of the time of death and where the body was when it was dead, because they're only in certain areas. And there's also today something called the CSI effect, which is a psychological term for juries are so used to watching TV shows on CSI that they automatically assume it's a lot more accurate than it actually is. So they're more likely to want CSI evidence and depend on it more than it's actually viable. And so there's two people I want to talk about. First of all, I'm going to end with Conan Doyle, because he really is a way more amazing man than we actually have any idea of. But I'm going to start with the mother of forensic science, and she was born, the mother of CSI, Frances Glessner Lee. She was an American, a woman, born very wealthy in 1878. She became friends with a Harvard pathologist who studied crime at the time. And he was very frustrated with the police techniques because of the lack of training of collecting evidence and finding out what happened. So in 1945, this woman, Frances Lee, developed these doll houses of crime scenes. And she would make these doll houses, which were crime scenes, and she would put clues in there and evidence in there and use them to train police on how to solve crimes at a crime scene. And she called them nutshells, and she did about 30 of them. I don't know how many. And she was so brilliant that they awarded her an honorary captain in the New York Police, because she helped, and she trained forensic scientists in America with her techniques and her brilliant mind. And they're still used as a teaching tool today. One of the teachings of CSI is to recreate this crime scene.
Right.
And actually on the show CSI, which I of course watch,
Me too.
there was an episode which would an homage to Frances Lee, I think, because the killer in this TV show made these dollhouse replicas of his murders. And that was one of the clues he left behind for the CSI to discover.
Wow.
He was trying to, torture the CSI and say,
Right.
this is, So they had that in one of their episodes, which I remembered, and I suspect it was an homage to Frances Lee. But I want to go on now to something else. Now, Sherlock Holmes, we all know and love. I'm a huge fan myself. Conan Doyle was born in 1859. He lived to 1930. And he wrote the first Sherlock Holmes in 1890, which was just at the right at the end of the 1800s. And he was trained as a doctor, and he had a brilliant mind. You're going to hear really how smart Conan, what a genius he really was, because we all know him and love him as the author of Sherlock Holmes. But what you don't maybe know is that in those days in England, all the police would do, they wouldn't collect much evidence. They would go out and find a likely suspect and beat him up until he confessed. And that was how the police worked then. But Conan Doyle introduced this idea, which was in ancient China in 1248. But he said, why not? Sherlock Holmes looked at minute details, and he formed all these conclusions using scientific analysis, a new idea in England at the time. And his stories so inspired the genius scientists of the time that they went out and they invented some of the things that Conan Doyle only put in his stories as imaginary things, but they invented a lot of his things that he suggested in his stories. And it was really, and I'll tell you the things he suggested in his stories, using the footprints to determine the gait, the height, and the weight of the person leaving the footprints. He suggested that idea. They didn't even know. And how much if they were carrying a heavy load, and in which hand, maybe Conan Doyle suggested fingerprints 11 years before Scotland Yard actually started using fingerprints. The ciphers, if you've read some of his books, he has these ciphers, which are codes, secret codes. And he suggested ciphers in his novels that were used in World War I and World War II from ideas that he'd had in his books. He suggested the idea of using plaster of Paris to record footprints at a crime scene. They still do that today. He suggested analyzing handwriting to discover a profile of the person that wrote it, see if they were under duress or drugs. They still do that today. He was trained as a scientist, a doctor, but he literally was 120 years ahead of his time. He also, Sherlock Holmes, would try to protect the crime scene from contamination, which was a new idea, that, instead of people walking all over everything. And he also suggested the idea of ballistics and using bullet trajectory to, he suggested a study of poisons so that you could tell when the person died if they'd been poisoned and what poison was used. He did crime scene reconstruction and criminal profiling. And there was a man named Edmond Lecard who was French, and he was known as the French Sherlock Holmes. And he actually was a forensic scientist, and he loved Conan Doyle. He was an avid fan of his books. And Edmond Lecard was known as the Sherlock Holmes of France, and he really was a forensic doctor. And in 1910, he created the first real forensic lab in France, 25 years after Doyle imagined it. He kept samples of soil samples. He used microscopes, all inspired by Conan Doyle. He did gait analysis, which I just mentioned, Conan Doyle suggested in his books. And Conan Doyle suggested the test for luminol, but he didn't create it, but he suggested there ought to be a test to determine if there was blood at a crime scene, even if people tried to clean it up and you couldn't see it. When they spray and it lights up under a black light. Conan Doyle thought of that, and 56 years later they invented it. Wow. So it's just amazing. And he modeled his character of Sherlock Holmes after a real-life doctor, Joseph Bell, who was a Scottish doctor. And Dr. Bell was, I don't know if he was a drug addict, because Sherlock Holmes in the books is a morphine addict. I'm not sure what it is. But Dr. Bell was a genius, and he was the real-life person that Conan Doyle solved 2 crimes on his own for real, and got 2 people who were wrongly convicted released on his own. And Dr. Bell used to work with the police, and he was the inspiration for the character of Sherlock Holmes because he solved things by deduction. And he would look at you and he would tell you all about yourself just by observing you know,
Wow.
carefully
Right. Terrific.
observing you. And this is where Conan Doyle got the idea for Sherlock Holmes. And I read this last piece on Dr. Bell. He was consulted, Dr. Bell was, at the case of Jack the Ripper, which fascinated the entire English-speaking world and was never solved. And Dr. Bell had a theory who did it, and he wrote a secret letter to Scotland Yard. I don't know who the killer he named as the killer, but after he did that, the murders stopped. So I don't know what happened. It's possible the police went out and just killed the guy. They might have just done it, you know, if they didn't have enough evidence on him, they might have just. But after he wrote this letter, the murders stopped.
Wow.
So I will be talking about Jack the Ripper in another series, and I'll try to get more facts on that. But anyway, so that's about it on CSI, and I'm happy to take any questions. Not that I know that much, but I love crime dramas, so. And thank you, Mimi, for videotaping me, and we're done, so.